Hey guys, what's up? This is Meathead Mikkel from meatheadgaming.com, and today I want to make kind of a quicker video about toughness. And because, a few days ago, I put up a video about where you should put your Paragon points first, and I'll link that in the description below. And in there I talked a little bit about toughness and, all resist, armor, life percentage, and kind of how they interact with each other and that sort of thing. And, I got some comments from people saying that, well, you should do armor above all resist for like intelligence-based classes, and I kind of explained why that's not correct. So today I want to talk a little bit more in depth about that, because the toughness value itself can actually be very, very misleading, and it kind of has to do with how you arrive at this toughness number. So yes, this is basically EHP, or effective health points, for those of you who kind of did the calculations back in Diablo 1.0, or Diablo Vanilla, if you will. But depending on how you build your character, especially with ROS coming up and no longer being able to use lifesteal, having to use other forms of sustain like life on hit, certain skills give life, and passive life regeneration, then you really kind of have to think about how you want to arrive at a toughness number. And a higher toughness value is not always better than a lower toughness number. Same thing with damage. A lot of people are figuring out that the character sheet DPS, it matters, but it's not the full story, because you have skills. You have things like, okay, well, arcane skills deal 19% more damage, but that's not actually reflected in this sheet. So, this doesn't tell the whole story, is what I'm trying to get at. And so I want to talk about kind of the different things that give you toughness. So right now, the main things are going to be, obviously in the defense tab, it's going to be your armor, block chance, dodge chance, all resist, and then also, some other modifiers that are actually like elite damage reduction, melee, and missile, which are actually not calculated in here. Like, I can put on a storm shield for elite and melee reduction. I could put on String of Ears for melee reduction. I could put on Eye of Etlik for ranged reduction. None of that's going to actually show up in your toughness value, but it will show up here. But we're not going to talk about those. We're going to talk about just kind of a more fundamental understanding of toughness. So first things first, like if I look at my Paragon points and I'm almost at 400, if I do all resist and life percentage, I end up with 1.8 million toughness at 132,000 hit points, right? Now if I were to change this, and let's say I max out all resist and armor, well, now my hit points drop to 109, and I drop about 100 or so, 100,000 or so toughness, which, this is less. So for a lot of people, you would think, well, this is worse. Well, actually, it's not, and I'm going to explain why. Because life percentage is actually, like, how much hit points you have is directly tied into your healing, and the more hit points you have, the less effective your healing amount in aggregate becomes. So like your, basically like your life on hit and your life per second, and then like your life per resource spent. So like monks have life per spirit spent, barbs have life per fury spent, that sort of thing. So, and we may also see like wizards and witch doctors and demon hunters also get something that's, I don't think Crusader has it either, but something that's gives you sustain based on how much resources you spend. We may or may not see that. It's not in the game currently. But anyway, so even though this number is less, it's actually better for me, because each point of life that I now have actually becomes more effective. Like, it's going to take more damage to reduce the same amount of hit points, if that makes sense. And another thing that I want to talk about is all resist versus armor. So one of the comments I got was, well, for int classes you already have a bunch of all resists, so you shouldn't, you should put points in armor because you're going to get more armor. Well, not exactly. So armor and all resist are kind of at a 10-to-1 ratio. So 10 armor roughly equals 1 resist, or 1 all resist. and it's not exactly linear, but it's very close. Like if you have, 1,000 all resist and you only have 5,000 armor, then every 10 points of armor is actually going to be worth a little bit more than 1 point in all resist, and it's got nothing to do with like the percentages that show up here. It's just a mathematical thing in the background. Like these percentages are actually fairly misleading, but so they're basically at a 10-to-1 ratio, and when they're at a 10-to-1, like if you have 10,000 armor and 1,000 all resist, then at that point, like 10 armor will give you the exact same mitigation as 1 all resist. That's just something to note. It's not really that big of a difference. Like if you play around with some of the HP calculators that are available out on the internet, you'll see that, if they're not kind of in sync with each other, if armor and all resist are not in sync, then one becomes slightly more valuable than the other, but it's not a huge difference. So anyway, going back to this, for all classes except for strength classes, so basically everyone except for a Crusader and a Barbarian, and a Crusader especially, you're going to want to do all resist above armor, because you would need, to get like 25% armor, in order to get 2,500 armor, which would equal 250 all resist, you would need a base of 10,000 armor. And if you're not a strength-based class, you're probably not going to have 10,000 armor. Maybe if like you get armor rolls on everything and you're using a shield with an armor roll, and you're using some other kind of skill or passive or effect or something that increases your armor, you would hit 10,000 as a non-strength character, but that's a very tall order. And even in Reaper of Souls, like armor slots, they roll more armor, or excuse me, item slots roll more armor, but not that much more. Like not in a competitive rate with resist all. So 25% armor only equals resist all if you have 10,000 base. And for strength characters, like with higher level of gear, at level 70, you're going to have approximately 10,000 main stat. That's for every class. That's kind of like the higher end of gear, and just from the videos that I've seen of beta. And so at that point, yes, this is going to be competitive with all resist, but you should still max all resist in like 99% of cases first, and then go to armor. But typically you're going to want to do this and then armor, and then do either life percentage or life regeneration. And the reason for this is, again, because the more armor and all resist you have, the more valuable each point of life becomes. So then your life regeneration, your life on hit, and things like that are going to become more valuable and more effective. And that's going to be absolutely critical in ROS, where lifesteal no longer exists. So that's something to keep in mind. As far as other Paragon points, life on hit is going to be huge, and life regeneration is going to be huge. Now let's talk about some of the other mitigation stats. So, shields, Crusaders are going to use shields. Some barbs will, some monks will, but not a lot. Like most barbs and monks are not going to use shields just because you give up so much damage. It's not kind of like a core design for the class. So not a lot of people are going to be using block, but obviously a shield is going to block a significant amount of damage, and it might reduce damage by like 4,000 or 5,000 per block, but that's after mitigation, so it's actually reducing damage significantly. Like it's every time you block it, in most cases, with the exception of like really heavy hits from enemies, you're not taking any damage. So a block in most situations actually like completely negates all damage. So it's pretty valuable. Again, not a lot of classes are going to be using it, but that's just something to keep in mind. And block also works with like ground effects, like Desecrator, Molten, Plagued, things like that. It might not always show up because those abilities actually tick really fast. They kind of tick progressively. So like if you're seeing a Desecrator, you'll see your hit points slowly drop, or not slowly, but they'll drop incrementally over time. You're not going to see them drop in big chunks. But block does work with that. So that is something to keep in mind. Dodge is a very interesting mechanic, because dodge becomes really, really valuable at very high levels. I mean, when you're talking about like 75% or so dodge upwards, that's when dodge becomes huge. But it is RNG based, and until you get to those ridiculously high levels, it's actually a kind of a poor stat, just because you're kind of giving it up to luck. Like if you can mitigate normal attacks, but let's say like you can't take a single hit from Asmodan's fireball, and you're not lucky enough to dodge it, and I mean it's pretty easy to avoid, but let's just say that you cannot dodge a fireball from Asmodan, like that, the RNG proc just doesn't happen for you, and you can't actually take the hit because your armor and all resist are low because you're a demon hunter or a monk and all your points are in dexterity, then you're gonna die, and that's kind of like a luck of the draw type thing. Um, Whereas if you're like a strength class or even an int class and you have just high mitigation that's up all the time, you're not like you can still survive one of those hits if you gear properly and you're playing at a adequate torment difficulty or whatever difficulty it happens to be. So dodge is an interesting mechanic. It does add a significant amount of toughness, especially if you're a class that doesn't use dodge at all. Then maybe like you group up with a monk, or you have some skill that increases dodge. Like barbarians have a Warcry rune that increases dodge chance, and it will help. It will definitely help, but just know that because it's RNG based. Until you get to ridiculously high amounts, it's actually a fairly poor stat. It's not something you should really rely on. So that's just something else to keep in mind. Another thing that's interesting is this crowd control reduction, or this other damage reduction. This is kind of like a quasi damage mitigation stat, because if you're stunned, you're frozen, feared, whatever, you are going to take damage, and you can't really do anything about it unless you have something that can break crowd control. So I wouldn't really spec for this necessarily, but it's something to keep in mind. And really, I don't want to make this video too long, but I do kind of want to explain the difference between the different types of toughness. And this number is, again, it's often misleading. So stick to resist all, armor. I would put points in life last. And even your core stats, once you kind of max out movement speed and arcane power, which in the other video I discussed why you should go for these first in Reaper of Souls, go for your primary stat. Don't put anything into vitality. You're going to get enough vitality from gear, and unless you're like doing some like razor thin build where like it's the difference between Torment 5 and Torment 6, if you just have a couple extra 100 points of vitality, then sure. But typically I would advise against this. Your primary stat is going to be way better, not just because it gives you damage, but because it also gives you toughness, but in the form of, not in the form of hit points. So because this gives you toughness, that's not life, it actually makes your healing and your sustain more effective. So I know this might be a little bit long-winded. The point that I'm trying to make is life percentage, and generally speaking, trying to increase your toughness through just sheer amount of vitality and hit points alone is actually not a very good idea, because your sustain is not going to be able to keep up. You're going to have this huge health pool, and no matter how much healing you have, it's just every hit point is worth less. So it's just not going to be an effective way to build a character. And the final thing I want to talk about is diamonds. So that's another reason to stack all resist and stack armor and not worry about hit points, because diamonds, I believe they roll up to like 100 all resist if you get the highest level, and that's going to be huge for mitigation, absolutely huge, and way better than life. And unfortunately, there's not like a gem that will give you 1,000 armor. And armor rolls, the amount of armor on items is once again lower than what you would get from all resist. So build your character using all resist, armor, not necessarily life percentage, and then your sustain is going to become a lot more effective. So anyway, thanks for watching, guys. This is Meathead Mikkel from meatheadgaming.com. thumbs up if you like it. I'm building my new computer right now as we speak, and I'll see you guys in ROS.